In this video, I want to explain kind of through some pictures and then through the classical externality diagram, what is a negative externality. So in consumer theory and producer theory, we talk a lot about supply and demand. We've got a market here, and this is where suppliers and consumers come together. And we've talked about a little bit with like welfare analysis. We talk about how consumers get consumer surplus, so they love the market. Suppliers get producer surplus, so they love the market, or they might even get some profit if they're a monopolist. But both consumers and producers are made better off by going to the market. And so we have this reason to be have a very favorable view of a market economy. But when we start talking about externalities, we need to start talking about a third group of individuals. And these are bystanders to the market. Consumers might be buying something like iron ore or electricity. Suppliers might be providing that electricity. And then there's some byproduct of this process of creating it or consuming it that creates some kind of externality, something that affects bystanders. And the problem with this isn't that bystanders are affected. The problem is that bystanders are not involved in the decision about what quantity ultimately gets produced. And we'll make that idea a lot more precise. But for now, just sort of schematically think of an externality as a lightning bolt sort of coming from the market and striking bystanders. And bystanders are just sitting over here and they're saying, oh man, what happened? Ouch. And so this is the picture of a negative externality. Negative externality is, suppliers and consumers get together. They're happy as a pig in mud because they've come away from the market with consumer surplus. But as a byproduct, there's been this negative externality that has affected bystanders to this market. So let's start with our supply and demand diagram. We've got demand slopes downward sloping. It represents the marginal willingness to pay of consumers for a given quantity. We've got supply, it slopes upward, and that gives us the marginal cost of producers at a given quantity. And where they intersect is where we will tend to go in this analysis. So supply and demand intersect under perfect competition. We're going to end up with an equilibrium price and quantity given by the intersection of supply and demand. That's just sort of basic supply and demand. But now we're going to introduce the tweak that there's a set of bystanders who experience a cost when this good is traded in the market. And their cost is given by this curve, this red curve, this marginal external cost. So each additional unit that's produced or consumed, we want to know how much additional that costs society or costs these bystanders. It's going to be the height of this red curve. So in addition to the marginal costs of suppliers, we have this cost that goes unaccounted for, and hence the word external. It's external to the decision makers in this market. So if we were to think about this, it's probably a good idea to add supply and marginal external cost to get the marginal cost of everyone who we care about in this market. So when you think of a negative externality, this maroon curve is where is the marginal cost curve we should account for, and we should go to where that intersects the demand curve. But we don't. That's the problem with a negative externality. In a negative externality, we go to where supply meets demand because suppliers and demanders are the only ones deciding over whether this product gets traded in this market. This is actually where we should go because that's where marginal social cost crosses marginal social benefit or marginal willingness to pay, and trading additional units actually costs society on the margin more than it gains in sort of willingness to pay, marginal value for those units of product. But the problem is that not all of society's costs are accounted for by the suppliers, and specifically these external costs are borne by bystanders who just bear these costs. And so what ends up happening is where we should go isn't where we end up going. We actually go to where supply meets demand because that's where private individuals end up trading toward an equilibrium. And so we go to the standard supply meets demand. So supply meets demand at this blue star. That's where we actually go. We get a quantity traded that's out here, but we get inefficiently too much of this good produced. We really should go where marginal social cost crosses marginal external cost.